Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to TBR's webcast, New Investments in the Carrier Data Center, highlighting the shift towards virtualization. My name is Allison Crawford, and I will be your host for today's webinar. Operators are offering more cloud services which require significant data center investment, and to achieve this transition, operators must also invest in network function virtualization technologies. During the course of this presentation, Executive Analyst Michael Sullivan-Trainor will discuss his perceptions of this trend and highlight initial research findings. Before I pass this over to Michael, there are a few logistics I'd like to cover. First, we're recording today's session and posting it on our YouTube site, TBRI channel. We encourage you to visit our channel to watch this presentation or any of the others we've posted. Second, we'd like to hear your opinions and thoughts on the materials we're presenting. Please send any questions or comments to the Q&A or chat function to the right of your screen. Michael will address them at the end of the presentation. Or if you'd like to set up a client inquiry for more detailed discussion, please reach out directly to Michael at the end of the webinar to set up that conversation. Third, we'll send out the slides to everyone registered for today's webcast within 24 hours of the conclusion of the webinar. You can also find these slides as well as other thought leadership pieces, webinar decks, and commentaries on SlideShare at www.slideshare.net/TBR_market_insight. And I'll share all these social media links with you again at the end of the presentation. Now let me introduce Michael Sullivan-Trainor. For the last 7 years, Michael has covered the telecom vendor and service provider landscape. He has extensive insight into emerging trends and is the content and consulting lead for the networking and mobility practice. He is frequently called upon by our clients to provide strategic insight to help navigate the shifting market landscape. And with that, let me hand this over to Michael.
Thank you, Allison, and thank you for joining us today for this webinar. In this session, we'll learn about the transformation that's taking place in the service provider marketplace, documenting two forms of transformation, the carrier cloud development and the movement towards network function virtualization. We'll talk about how the carriers are addressing those opportunities, what's stimulating their change, and how they are faring in the marketplace against other competitors. Specifically, we're going to highlight AT&T and Verizon as two examples of carriers that are in a common national and global market and how they're advancing on these trends. We'll define network function virtualization and chart its progress, look at some service provider initiatives with respect to network function virtualization, supplier positioning that's been taking place in the marketplace for NFV. What are some of the early functions that we see moving towards NFV? And then end with how, over the long term, the expectations of service providers are going to cause a shift in their spend towards software and NFV, and ultimately a brave new world of packaging for the supplier. So with that, let's get started. The stimulation for these transformations is no surprise. These two gentlemen are on the carrier's most wanted list, emblematic of the seismic changes that their companies have created in the marketplace. On the one hand, we have Jeff Bezos and Amazon, which has not only disrupted the traditional data services provided over carrier networks, taking away much of the monetization opportunity they had, but has also done a very similar approach to the cloud with a set of cloud services that are now causing service providers to be very aware of a feeling that they may have missed the boat on cloud. In a very similar fashion, of course, we have Google and Eric Schmidt on the right. Google has taken a number of initiatives in a similar fashion. The main area where service providers are looking at these firms is is still, in fact, a lot of ongoing initiatives to compete on a revenue challenge basis. How do service providers monetize those data services over their networks in the same way that Amazon and Google are able to do that? Through efforts such as customer experience management improvement and ways to do some service exposure for over-the-top services. But those are topics for another webinar. The focus here on NFV and cloud is really about the service provider also looking at Amazon and Google and saying, well, how are they able to be so innovative? How are they able to put forward such successful cloud services and related services with seemingly immediate time to market when service providers are unable to do that. So we hear the term agility. So how do service providers become more agile in a fashion similar to Amazon and Google, or to take it in broadly, an internet model? Increasingly, service providers are seeing network function virtualization and the cloud services that it supports as a way to bring agility into their networks and move them to a space where they can be more competitive with Google and Amazon and other over-the-top players. That competition and that threat has caused the service providers to go in two directions in terms of their investment and transformation to respond to the loss of revenue and the need for agility. On one hand, we have carrier cloud. And what we mean by carrier cloud is the ability to deliver cloud services at an improved quality of service on a global scale. And carriers, large service providers, see this as rightfully so, as a differentiator compared to the Amazons and Googles of the world. The global presence and ability to deliver quality of service over the network are two key points that allow the service providers to begin to move to a place where they can not only challenge the revenue base of a Google or as Amazon, but carve out their own space in that regard. Already we see this happening. Most of the large global carriers, certainly firms like AT&T and Verizon, BT, Orange, NTT, or Telefonica, already have global data center footprints across multiple regions. On these data center footprints, they've already established robust enterprise businesses, have for a number of years, providing enterprise services, communication services, increasingly vertical services and horizontal applications as well. Cloud services is the next natural implementation, and many of them have implemented cloud services across these global data center infrastructures. They're now moving towards strengthening those investments, competing more aggressively with each other to determine who's going to have the most robust and broad data center footprint to put forward cloud services to service the enterprise, and the ability to be a broker for multi-cloud services for themselves, other service providers, and enterprises. So this is clearly a very active, competitive environment, and we see a significant spend shift going on in the global service providers towards the carrier cloud model, seeing that as a revenue opportunity that is perhaps not something that can be strongly challenged, at least on the enterprise or high quality of service level, by a Google or an Amazon or others, and makes the competitive environment much more manageable. This particular case, we see a highlight here, British Telecom and its footprint, which you see as multiple data centers across multiple regions. They and others are continuing to add data centers to their portfolio to provide infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service, and more advanced cloud-specific services to address enterprise and vertical needs. So that's one major transformation, one place, if you will, where we see carriers placing their bets, putting their money in light of the competition they have faced from the stimulus of the OTT players. The other place where they're beginning to place some bets is network function virtualization. And here we'll go more detail into network function virtualization, but what we're showing on the right-hand side of this slide is the NFV's industry specification group's view of what NFV is. As you may know, a large group of suppliers and carriers have gotten together under the auspices of ETSI to develop the network function virtualization view and specification to drive the industry forward. So here we see the disaggregation of the virtual applications in a virtual appliance format, which is comprised primarily of software operating in an orchestrated and automated fashion across a set of standard servers and taking advantage of standardized storage resources and utilizing standard networking interfaces, and including leveraging software-defined networking to provide maximum efficiency and programmability across the network. This concept has a lot of value from the service provider standpoint in terms of increasing the agility of how they are able to provision services today. The expectation is that a whole layer of innovation can be placed upon the new, more flexible, easily distributed automated network functions to create new revenue opportunities. But in the meantime, one of the major drivers for NFV is reducing spending. The perception that the hardware costs can be dramatically reduced, and then they can be reduced CapEx because of the and OpEx because of the reduction in the multiple instances of new service deployments when the provisioning is done across a standard NFV architecture. So these are two transformations that are happening, one outside of the carrier network in the external data center footprint, the other inside the carrier network, moving very rapidly to virtualize network functions. So if we look a little bit at the first set, the dilemma around cloud a little bit more deeply, here we are showing TBR's carrier public cloud market and public cloud benchmark. And observe that the players here are mostly cloud service providers, very few actual telco service providers, and highlights that point that has just been made about the strength in the marketplace of Amazon. Much to the chagrin of companies such as Verizon and AT&T, we see they have very small market presence relative to the other public cloud service providers, and relatively speaking, a lower rate of growth as well. This is a snapshot of the market on a quarterly basis. So the concern here, of course, is that the large carriers, AT&T and Verizon among them, are not in a position that they need to be in this marketplace. It reflects a public cloud market position. We feel they are better positioned in the private cloud market and are more able to leverage the data center area, that global footprint we mentioned across enterprises. However, they are not ignoring the public cloud market either. We expect continued major investment in public cloud infrastructure in order to be more competitive with the Amazons and other firms in the cloud service provider marketplace. Putting a finer point on that, so where do Verizon and AT&T, for example, stand in the public cloud marketplace? We see that they are at relative parity. Should also mention they're at relative parity in the enterprise business as well. So we're using them as examples of typical cloud-driven service providers who are looking at how to leverage this environment as global players with significant ability to invest. And clearly this level of revenue, and as we saw on the previous chart, that level of position in the market is not satisfying to these companies which are used to be market leaders. And so going forward, we expect a much greater investment by Verizon and AT&T in both public and private cloud, leveraging their global footprint, leveraging their traditional positions in enterprise services and relationships with subscribers. They are also competing very directly with each other, layering in new enterprise services, a combination of public and hybrid clouds for enterprises, moving to brokering clouds across service provider networks and across enterprises. There are significant internal development plans and expectations that those plans are going to be supported by suppliers that understand this need to have these companies become more revenue-driven by cloud infrastructure and by NFV infrastructure. Taking that down one level further, if we, for example, look at Verizon's investment portfolio going into 2013, we see that they are, in fact, building out new data centers that have cloud enablement, even on top of their existing Terremark footprint, with new data centers in London and Dallas. We see them competing with a new take on a service offer against Verizon, moving from a monthly resource pool way to package cloud services, infrastructure as a service, to an instances on demand approach, which mirrors how Amazon is taking to market. So very sensitive to how Amazon's approaching the marketplace and trying to be very competitive and build up that revenue base. Then we see Verizon's ability to leverage one of the service provider assets, which is being able to drive improvements in security to leverage some of its assets. So role-based access control and certificate-based multi-factor authentication added to its public cloud delivery to be able to improve upon the kind of service you would get from an Amazon. Finally, what are they doing about internal investments? And we see that their head of the Terremark business, the CTO, John Considine, highlights the value of the cloud broker model, where the ability to manage workloads across multiple sites and providers is another target market that Verizon feels like it can aim for, and does echo what I mentioned earlier, the carrier ability to work across multiple cloud infrastructures for service providers and for enterprises as a key revenue-driving opportunity that separates itself from some of the competition. The final question that's addressed here is, are they going to buy it or build it? Many of these large global carriers have a tendency to do it yourself. And for instance, in this case, we see Verizon Terremark building its own controller for software-defined networks for specific workloads to orchestrate cloud functions. We expect that these service providers are going to offer a mix. No one service provider believes they're going to be able to solve and build all the necessary technology. In fact, that would really mitigate the ability to reduce costs. So they're looking for standardized components, but the standardization will have to comply with the internal customizations that they're interested in working with, that they feel are going to be most efficient for their infrastructure. Not a new story about how they like to consume technology, not something that's changing. Perhaps the appetite for more standard platforms and more standard interfaces will be much greater, but still expect a large content of homegrown, home-built functions and architecture. Leaving those specific examples, I want to move to a discussion of the network functionalization market and what's happening. So we all know that the key concept, it's about transforming the network from a large number of different elements, separate functionality, to infrastructure of high-volume servers and storage elements that are independent of those functions, and the ability to distribute the functions where they are needed in the network for the requirement of provisioning a particular service, for improving bandwidth, for all the typical reasons why we need to implement infrastructure. The issue that needs to be solved, of course, with network function virtualization is the ability to deliver carrier-grade reliability and scale across a set of virtual functions on a global scale network. And that is yet to be proven. There is significant work being done to move those specifications forward, but at this stage we see investments in individual functions and individual provisioning instances for what I say are non-core applications, but we have yet to see full carrier-grade reliability and scalability in virtual network function environment. In addition to solving that very challenging technical problem is the expectation is going to cost less. Certainly there will be a reduction in CapEx in terms of the hardware investment, but the operational efficiency regarding implementing the software is going to take time to manifest. It's going to take time to deliver the complexity required in the software, and then the integration with the network to be able to make those functions actually reliable, scalable, and so on. Similarly, it will take time to acquire the application and services agility that carriers are looking for. So this is not an instant fix. Nevertheless, the investments are moving along pretty quickly The standardization is probably taking the lead. As I highlight here, we see the NFV industry specification group. The members now read as a who's who of service provider and suppliers in the industry. It's quite remarkable. This is relatively quickly manifested over the last several months to become a major force in the industry. And we see it growing very fast. Just also highlighted on this slide, excuse me, are a couple of viewpoints from one of the architects of really the NFV group, one of the leaders in Deutsche Telekom. The goal then is to have suppliers deliver best-of-breed virtual functions that are available on purpose-built hardware, standard hardware, as well as an NFV platform that can be optimized. So this stakes out there are at least two components here to NFV on the software side. One is the function themselves. The other is the orchestration and automation platform that supports NFV, and that's a very important pair of targets for suppliers to be aiming at in order to achieve some of the aims of the carriers for network function virtualization. So what are some examples? Again, we can turn to some of the firms that we've been discussing, AT&T, Verizon, and also highlighting Vodafone here, with what's going on for their NFV initiatives. We have AT&T making probably the most significant announcement of intention with its Domain 2.0 supplier program, where it set forth the expectation that network function virtualization and cloud infrastructure is basically going to be the way they evaluate domain players going forward, and moving against that roadmap is really how AT&T expects the future to evolve, and requires a different take from suppliers on how to move the network forward. AT&T's put forward, as all of these have, that this is about efficiency and cost savings as well as agility. AT&T is one of the founding members of the NFV ETSI Industry Specifications Group, as is Verizon. Verizon's been a bit less public about its approach to network function virtualization, but has put specifications into the marketplace, has been working on a lot of internal efforts, as is AT&T, to begin to experiment with some network functions and see if they can make the technology perform the way they'd like it to, and has, we believe, similar demands on suppliers to what AT&T is stating in Domain 2.0. Vodafone we see as coming up more as a participant and less of a founder in NFV, though interested in NFV. Clearly some of the areas of the network are perhaps more sensitive on the wireless side to being able to move to network function virtualization as we get into the infrastructure. And so Vodafone's going to be a strong player, but maybe taking a little bit less aggressive stance than a global carrier that has a multi-technology footprint. As we say there, the current status is proof of concept. NFV POC means most of these things today are in proof of concept. Proof of concept in 13, moving forward in 14 to more than proof of concept. There is an interest in an industry standard solution, but as I mentioned earlier, industry standard needs to be defined where the standardization is desired and where the service provider's own view of what the solution should look like must be understood, that compromise between the two. Exemplified perhaps by the statement around Verizon, where point solutions to enhance their network is more or as important to them as the industry standards approach. The lead suppliers for these solutions on a high level, on a strategic level, tend to be the usual suspects. That is, the installed base players in the network are being among the first that are turned to deliver on some early specifications on network functionalization, participants in the POCs. So we see in the operators, the providers we're looking at, Alcatel-Lucent, Ericsson, IBM, HP and Cisco, and NSN in the case of Vodafone. So these are some of the players. It's not limited to this set of players. players in OSS, BSS, such as Amdocs, players in all areas of the network are being tasked with coming up with a roadmap that has an NFV view and also being asked to participate in POCs. A little bit more on suppliers. So what are some of the supplier approaches to this marketplace? They're all a little bit different, which suggests that there will be some time before we have anything that really resembles standard solutions in the marketplace. Most of them come from a cloud platform, so the notion that the cloud or the virtualization platform must be established, and then upon that is layered the virtual applications, the virtual function applications. So we see Alcatel-Lucent with its cloud-band management platform and cloud nodes, and we see it moving towards NFV with some research facility investment, as well as opening up a cloud-band ecosystem. The focus here for Alcatel-Lucent is to be that platform that is resident in the network that can onboard network virtual functions, rather than be the inventor of the functions themselves, really wanting to be the platform of choice for those functions. Another platform of choice player is of course, Cisco, that has a number of initiatives regarding SDN and NFV. The deployment of elements in some operators such as KDDI and Telstra by Cisco suggests that it's moving a little bit further along in SDN and NFV than some of the others, though most of these are very closely tied to its routing infrastructure and very much in a Cisco-controlled environment and not quite that level of standardization perhaps that the industry is looking for. We see Ericsson moving forward with its cloud system as a candidate for the virtual network system that can host the NFVs. We also expect Ericsson to be developing a number of virtual functions, it being a strong player in the service layer of the network. So Ericsson's going to be addressing a broad set of solutions and has initially started with its cloud system. IBM and HP, and many would argue, are in a better position or a very strong position to address this market a little bit more significantly or clearly than the network equipment providers we've been highlighting, because they are coming from having built clouds for the enterprise, having created virtual platforms for cloud service automation of both the legacy and the new data center environments. And clearly most of this, all of this nearly happens in the operator's data center or the service provider data center. So HP and IBM may be considered to be in the pole position from a data center perspective to deliver on these capabilities. That said, when it comes to understanding the virtualization of the network functions and how they're going to work in a carrier-grade delivery environment, outside the data center, then we see a meeting of the infrastructure minds between a network equipment provider and an IT provider. So a mix of these solutions are going to be picked, and as the carriers have already said, on a best-of-breed basis to deliver on the network functions where they feel they can leverage the requirements. That is to say, the standardization, cost-effectiveness, but also carrier-grade delivery. And last but not least, in this particular view, is NSN, which is really focusing on the network elements lower down in the radio access, and trying for a combination that's a little bit less focused on the data center orientation, a little bit more focused on the network orientation. So interestingly, you can see NSN focusing on the virtualizing radio network elements on the access side. You can see Alcatel-Lucent focusing on the network platform aspect. So you can see these particular suppliers, because of their market positions, are really trying to carve out very clean domain niches and move aggressively on them. And perhaps they have a slightly different position than the Ericsson, HP, IBM, Cisco competition, which is more broad. some candidates for the network function virtualization, and where are we going to see the first implementations of network function virtualization? We've seen more activity in OSS, BSS, and policy control. Even before that, I'd say the session border control is key areas where already these are software-oriented platforms that can be virtualized on standard hardware. The leap is not too great to get to these platforms. Also, this virtualization can be done in the back office or the back end of the network without necessarily immediately affecting the scalability and capacity of the network. So the experimentation is happening with the IMS elements, OSS, BSS platforms, and policy elements, areas where there's already functionality in these platforms that the operators are interested in promulgating more broadly in the network, more advanced use of policy and DPI, perhaps different schemes for placing session border controllers, different ways to deploy security. A number of these are different ways in which existing functions can be spread more cleanly through the network, and therefore make good candidates for the distributed factors of virtualization, and then become part of that experimentation. Can they be distributed, orchestrated, and automated in the way NFV promises? We expect radio access elements and mobile core network elements to come a bit later and be a bit more challenging to migrate to virtual environments, just to manage the complexity of the traffic that they have to handle. So these are some of the key areas where we see the investment. As you can see, it's a fairly wide scope, and in fact, we think almost all the areas of the network will be open to network function. There'll be exceptions in RAN and transport and certain of the router elements, but a lot of the hardware in the network will be candidates for network function virtualization once the proof of concepts are passed and we have working versions of the technology. Back again to a little bit more on what some of the service providers are saying about NFV. This is through the lens of the spokespersons that have been put forward by the organization as participants in the NFV group, or NFV industry specification group. Concern about there being too much hype in the market, and we can all observe that there's been perhaps an overhyped area, though we're quickly, I think, going from hype to reality in NFV more rapidly than in some cases. A desire to already identify some standards, such as open flow, for the interfaces between the data and control plane, and delivering open flow compliant APIs, and of course delivering commoditized hardware. The main point, I think, I take away from Margaret's position here is that where the vendor should focus. The vendors need to focus on innovation in software and not no longer focus on hardware, except that the CapEx is going to be withdrawn from the hardware part of it. And the place to innovate is in the software architecture that's going to bring about a carrier-grade flavor of NFV and not just instances of NFV that work in an isolated environment. So what are Verizon's expectations then of NFV? And here we do have a statement that Verizon has been engaged in NFV POCs for quite some time across their different customer types. And they do see that the low cost and increased agility are key areas, key outcomes they expect there. In addition to that, the reason for the agility is because of the shifting traffic patterns and shifting user behavior. So the environment is very dynamic. And just to underline that, we really didn't mention that yet, it's not just about cost savings and operational flexibility. There's a very real challenge in the service provider marketplace that not dealing with coming up with a new way to architect the network and make it more agile is going to make the network at some point unsustainable, given what we've already seen for data traffic and the likelihood that data traffic is only going to continue to grow. Several predictions of that as we see more usage of smart devices and so on, and M2M as well. Bottom line, though, we have what typically the carriers are saying now is that the tools for a true operational environment, by that it's a standard way to move across virtual network functions and deliver that orchestration and automation across the carrier network is what's lacking and is one of the things that has to be delivered beyond the POCs. So management and orchestration, which go above the functions or along with the functions, back to that point that was made by the Deutsche Telekom quote that there are two major components to this to think about the functions themselves and the virtualization layer that involves management orchestration of the functions, and understand that that's not going to necessarily mean just the individual supplier's own environment. It's a multi-supplier environment operating across some sense of standardization. So that's the ask, and it's a tough ask because each supplier wants to be the one to be the platform of choice for all of this. So that is one of the multi-vendor challenges that causes carriers like this to say, well, maybe more of this we need to do ourselves, and the part that we can standardize across vendors we will. So this is a little bit of the balance act that is being determined right now in network function virtualization. This slide is a bit speculative in terms of how we're thinking about what this means for the marketplace. First of all, put forward the premise that there will be a smaller pie. The total amount of spend that the service provider is delivering into the network is going to go down. This is in line with the forecast that suggests that the investment in capacity and traditional infrastructure doesn't have the same scale of growth that it had previously. And I'm talking on a global basis, and there are, of course, regional differences and trends as different waves hit. Still seeing build up in APAC, for example, a little bit of struggling in Europe, and slowing down, but still had been a pretty hot market in the North American market. Taken together, we see NFV causing the ability to have the service provider operate with a smaller pie or smaller investment of CapEx because of the reduction in hardware. That said, it might surprise some to see that at the end of the day, NFV's impact in total spend is not to be overtaking the network. A huge amount of legacy technology and traditional network infrastructure that is not going anywhere. So these factors suggest that NFV is going to have a very important layering on top of the network as an orchestration automation layer of virtual function, but it will still be doing so over a very significant physical and in many cases legacy infrastructure, at least over the next few years, that will require a lot of the traditional services. So think of it as having a very important NFV initiative in layering that's actually going to be an entry point that lets the supplier stay in the key areas of the network domains that the service provider wants, but doesn't mean there's an elimination of the legacy networks. I think many service providers would be very happy to go from that 1% to 20%, and that says 20% of your network is now much more agile and is a platform for delivering a lot of different services in an innovative fashion, in the same way that a Google or a Amazon could deliver them. So something we're tracking, we're seeing the transition from 2013 to 2014 as a beginning of the turn in investment towards NFV by service providers, and a positioning of NFV solutions by the suppliers, and so tracking the scale of that, the size of that, the dimension of that, the multiple domains of that across regions and across the different business solutions is really where TBR is going to be focused in the coming months. And this is just an early stake in the ground to suggest that there's a major change underway, and it's going to have a significant impact on market spend. I'd like to conclude with a discussion about what this means for the packaging, what we call the brave new world of packaging for the supplier. So what we've tracked is the movement of the service provider's investment away from a proprietary environment to a more low-cost environment that's going to have tremendous standardization to it. End of the day, this is still an opportunity more than a threat, we think, for suppliers. It means, first of all, taking the view of understanding there's three different investment levels here, perhaps four if you consider the services level, which we're highlighting in green at the top. So there's a services play that has a requirement to be the designer and contributor to the architecture, the integration, perhaps manage part of these functional instances, virtual instances, or operated, and of course the ongoing requirement of maintaining it. All that said, that services business has a very different view of you're managing a collection of virtual instances across an orchestrated network rather than a lot of physical infrastructure. So what the maintenance business is of that is much more like a software support business than it is like a traditional customer support business. And so these kinds of things are going to be models that are going to be played out over the next several months and years. There is the server layer, which becomes more about moving from purpose-built or traditional proprietary hardware, custom-built proprietary hardware, to purpose-built and third-party hardware, and even in some cases white boxes by where that's possible. So that clearly is a trend that's moving forward probably the most rapidly. And then the abstraction layer is very important, of course, being able to have, by this we mean not just the virtualization on the hardware, but also the management and orchestration pieces. Initially, that's always been an own platform built into a horizontal application that carry the own supplier's function. That needs to move to the ability to understand there may be third-party platforms that the function needs to be plugging into, just as there is third-party hardware that it needs to ride upon. And, of course, own functions. One other thing we're highlighting with this particular presentation of NFV packaging, initially the system supplier has been the one who's been deploying these three levels of function, and that's interesting but not sufficient to meet the requirements of NFV. On a software supplier, the second revolution then is system suppliers need to be thinking more like software suppliers. Not a shock there, since most of this is about software, but the software supplier doesn't really have that much concern for hardware. It's why we see software suppliers or ISVs or non-systems companies moving more rapidly to NFV and embracing it more easily, of course, than system suppliers, because they're already used to working with third-party hardware. It's about choosing which third-party hardware and perhaps changing the relationships to their hardware suppliers. But they are very much used to make sure they have their own platform for how the software is going to be virtualized, orchestrated, and managed across the different functional modules they're delivering. So the software supplier at some stage also has a challenge because they have to be able to be ready to move to that ISV mindset, where all perhaps an ISV has is a set of functions that will be implemented into a managed environment that might be provided by a third party or by the service provider themselves. So these different ways to go to market, especially I think the software supplier and ISV end up being the priority or most likely ways in which the NFV functions will be consumed are going to be very important shifts. And there are many things to think about here. Already we see in the marketplace session-based licensing that allows for these kinds of environments. So there's an upfront license fee, but then license utilization of the software is based on a session definition. And that's a functional licensing model that works today. What's less clear is how one would charge for virtual instances of network functions. So when the session may be comprised of multiple virtual instances or a given function has virtual instances, how does that get measured? You certainly can't charge the service provider for every instance, but something has to be done to draw some parameters around that so that the license or the value of the software is manifested for the supplier. And finally, the long-term value that many of the suppliers have provided to the service provider is to implement an infrastructure and being able to certify that it's actually going to be delivering as promised for the scalability, the carrier-grade quality of service, and the security. How is certification then taken on in this multi-vendor, multi-layer environment where essentially the supplier doesn't have control of the hardware anymore, doesn't have control maybe even of the orchestration and management, may only have control of their own functions. So they certainly aren't in a very strong position to certify. I think the resolution to that, perhaps short-term, perhaps long-term, is there will be certain of the select service suppliers that service providers will turn to and ask them to be the overarching certifiers of the environment and take on very much a multi-vendor, multi-platform, multi-function role. So it becomes much more about the chops to manage a multi-vendor, highly complex multi-vendor environment than it does own environment, which takes us out of thinking about it as a software play and moves it more into more of a systems integrator or a services play or even a managed services play. Oftentimes managed services, at least in early stages of these kinds of technologies, is a good way to get some of the issues ironed out and something delivered. So the positioning of those suppliers that we spoke about earlier, the key domain suppliers, to become that kind of overarching owner of this process is something else to consider to see if the company strategy is amenable to that, or is it amenable to be living in a particular functional area. So that is the conclusion of the presentation. Just to give a flavor of the carrier cloud investment and the parallel NFV investment. And with that, we have some time left for questions.
Great, thanks, Michael. We had one quick question that came in. It was more of a clarification. The question that came through, Michael, is does the 20% represent IMS and OSS BSS elements? I think that was back, about 3 slides back.
Right, so that represents more than that. That represents a larger list of the software elements that are being delivered into the network. But as I pointed out in those early years, the majority of them will be OSS, BSS control layer elements.
Okay. So the first question we had come through, what do you see as the chances for success for carriers to succeed with their cloud strategies?
So I think that speaks to the conversation earlier in the presentation about the competition with Amazon. And the part of my belief is they are already succeeding. If you define the cloud strategy as something that's distinct from having to be the marquee public cloud player, I think certainly on the private cloud and on what they're able to do with enterprises, I think they're already better positioned than an Amazon or a Google or any of the cloud service providers. And much of the work they do is not public, so I think that there's a significant leadership position in that realm already. Whether they need to take on the public cloud players and be successful in the public cloud market, I'm a little bit skeptical, just because it's a low-cost commodity business that service providers don't necessarily bring any particular strengths to that differentiates them from the Googles or Amazons. and their, call it the agility model, is still being developed, as we just saw. So their ability to deliver that kind of service agilely is challenged. I think the only way they can get to success may be to have some kind of public cloud infrastructure that's a little bit separate from the traditional way of doing business to really compete aggressively against the Amazons and Googles.
Okay. The next question we had come through: how does the SDN network automation fit into the investments? Is this in the 20%?
So SDN, elements of it are, that's part of that same infrastructure layering, and software-defined networks we're seeing mostly relevant to the routing and switching infrastructure, and so we see that disaggregation of elements already happening. The jury's a bit out on that because the solutions tend to still be fairly closely tied to the hardware, and the movement towards a standardization of hardware for SDN, to me, is a bit more challenging, perhaps a lot more challenging than it is in NFV. When we get deeper into the network, there's a reason we invented the routing and switching environments that we did invent. And I'm coming down a little bit, I think, perhaps on the Cisco side of the world there. That environment needs to be controlled very closely by the domain players, and so a little bit mitigating there of how much of that's going to be pure software.
Okay. Another question we had come through: when will NFV become a significant force in the market?
So I would say that NFV is already a significant force in the market, in that it's already causing product redesign. I'll take a case example of the latest version of Amdocs's Customer Experience Services platform, version 9, is a VMware certified delivery of a massive VSS-OSS deployment. That wouldn't have happened if the service providers had not, even as recently as earlier in the last two Mobile World Congresses, began to really put forward that NFV is something that must be paid attention to. So I think it's already a force from a specification standpoint. When it becomes a force that's revenue generating is really the harder question. Small revenue, I think, in 2014, more significant revenue in 2015 and 16. And of course, for folks like myself, one of the challenges is to understand where you draw the line and say what's NFV revenue versus revenue for that function that would have otherwise been allocated, and so that's where we're working to understand that separation. But that is something that we think will be happening within the next 2 or 3 years.
Okay, another question we have: what are your recommendations for suppliers to address opportunities?
So as I was highlighting earlier, the recommendations would be to stake out a position. Number one, it's very important to have that NFV strategy in place, and that's kind of a no-brainer at this point. The RFPs and RFIs are requiring suppliers to do that already. What needs to be thought about strategically is what's the position of the company there. Is it going to be to leverage NFV to be in that leadership automation orchestration position across domains, or is it going to be focusing on the functions only? It's really that decision to choose discrete domains or to become more of an end-to-end complete player, and perhaps the company stance already informs that. If I look at what's happened with the net business already, I see that ALU and NSN already appear to me to be driving a more of a domain-focused way to address this issue than a total solutions way. And that may be the right strategy for them. So leverage the value where the value is most likely to be available, I would say, rather than overreach. On the other hand, if you are an overarching vendor that can take on the orchestration automation across functions, that should be the position to play there. So I see at least two distinct strategies for large players, and then, of course, individual domain players. It's simply a matter of creating a strong, standards-compliant virtualization of the functions that you're already playing in.
Great. Looks like we don't have any additional questions in queue, so if anyone has any last-minute questions I'd like to ask Michael, please send them through now. So with that, I'd like to wrap up today's session. I want to thank you, Michael, for your time, and thanks everyone for joining us today. As I mentioned, here are all the social media links where you can join the conversation with Michael on Twitter, as well as TBR, as well as SlideShare and YouTube, where you'll be able to get the additional follow-up slides. And as I mentioned, we are sending the slides out to everyone who attended today's session. I know several people have asked for those slides, so we will be sending those out by tomorrow, as well as a link to the recording of the webinar if you'd like to watch it again or would like to share it with any of your colleagues. As you're leaving the webinar today, I have a quick favor to ask. We are running a short survey just to get feedback on quality of the presentation, quality of the presenter, and any other additional open comments you'd like to share. So if you would take the time to fill it out, we'd really much appreciate it. And if we don't hear from you again today to set up additional conversations, we look forward to speaking with you on future webinars that we'll be doing over the next quarter. So keep an eye out for those invitations as they come out, as well as additional thought leadership work that Michael will be doing over the course of the next quarter to 2 quarters. So thanks everyone for your time, and we look forward to speaking with you guys all again after the holiday. Have a great afternoon.